One of the most interesting and creepy stories I've found on Reddit. I want to share it with you. It's called Psychosis, and here's the beginning. I'm not sure why I'm writing this. Maybe I just need to get my thoughts out before they start slipping away. Lately, everything has been off. Not in a big, obvious way, just little things. Small inconsistencies that don't seem like much on their own but feel like a pattern when you put them together. It started with the silence. I live alone in a basement apartment, and I work from home as a freelance programmer. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills, and I don't have to deal with office drama or rush hour traffic. The downside? No real human interaction. Some days, I realize I haven't spoken a single word out loud. Normally, that doesn't bother me. But this week, the quiet has felt different. My building is usually noisy, thin walls, loud pipes, neighbors arguing, doors slamming. But lately, it's been dead. No footsteps in the hallway, no distant TV chatter, not even the sound of someone flushing a toilet. It's like I'm the only one here. At first, I figured people were just out more, maybe on vacation. But then I stepped outside. The city felt wrong. It was around noon when I left my apartment yesterday, just planning to grab a coffee and breathe in some fresh air. But the streets were empty. No cars honking, no people walking their dogs, no kids biking down the sidewalks. Even the sky seemed too still, gray clouds frozen in place, not a hint of wind. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe I had just stepped out during a lull, or maybe I'd been inside for so long that I was imagining things. But when I checked my phone, my messages hadn't been read. Not by Amy, my best friend, or anyone else. It wasn't just that they hadn't responded, they hadn't even opened them. That was the first real moment where the unease crept into my bones. When I got back to my apartment, I noticed something even stranger. My desk chair had moved. Just a little, angled slightly away from my computer. I knew I hadn't left it like that. I always push it in when I stand up, a stupid habit drilled into me from years of keeping my workspace tidy. And yet, there it was. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched settled over me like a heavy blanket. Then the phone rang. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It had been days since I last heard my ringtone, and for some reason, the sound made my stomach twist. The caller ID was an unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but at the last second, I answered. Hello. Silence. I strained to hear anything, breathing, background noise, anything at all. After a few seconds, a voice finally spoke. John. A wave of relief hit me. It was Amy. Hey. Where the hell have you been? I asked, laughing nervously. I've been trying to reach you for days. She hesitated. Oh, yeah, sorry. Been busy. Something about her voice made my skin crawl. It was flat. Distant. Like she was talking through a bad connection, except there was no static, no distortion, just a hollow, empty quality that didn't sound like her at all. You okay? I asked. You sound weird. She laughed, but it was wrong. Too slow, like someone replaying a recording at half speed. I'm fine, she said. Just, where are you? I frowned. Home. Same place I always am. A pause. Then, too quickly, oh. Right. A creeping sensation crawled up my spine. Amy, where are you? Silence. Then, finally, gotta go. The call ended. I stared at my phone, the screen darkening as the call history faded. The silence in my apartment pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed something. My desk chair had moved again. And this time, it was facing the door. I didn't sleep last night. Not even for a second. Every time I closed my eyes, a deep and uneasy feeling settled into my chest, keeping me frozen beneath the covers, my mind replaying the strange details of the last few days over and over again. I wasn't imagining things anymore. I knew something was wrong. But I had no idea just how deep that wrongness went. At first, it was the silence that disturbed me the most. I've lived in this apartment for nearly 3 years now, and I've always been aware of the sounds that come with it, footsteps from the neighbors upstairs, the occasional creak of the old pipes rattling through the walls, muffled conversations slipping through the thin drywall late at night. But now, it was as if the entire building had gone still, like every living thing had simply ceased to exist. That deep, unnatural quiet pressed down on me, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. And yet, despite the overwhelming stillness, small and unsettling changes kept creeping into my apartment, little things that made me question whether I was truly alone or if someone, or something, was inside with me, moving unseen. The first thing I noticed was my chair. Yesterday, I found it angled away from my desk again, even though I had made sure to push it in the night before. At the time, I told myself it was nothing, that maybe I had bumped it without realizing, that I was simply overthinking. But then, this morning, I walked into the kitchen and immediately felt a strange and disorienting sense of wrongness. It took me a second to place it, but when I did, my stomach turned. A spoon. A single, silver spoon, taken from my coffee mug and placed inside the freezer, sitting neatly atop a bag of frozen peas. I stood there for what felt like minutes, staring at it, trying to recall any moment in which I could have absent-mindedly done something like this. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't come up with a single logical explanation. The last time I had used that spoon, I had left it in the sink. I was certain of it. The unease settled in my bones, a creeping paranoia that only worsened as I moved through my apartment. The shoes that I always left by the door had somehow ended up inside the bathroom, placed perfectly side by side in front of the sink as if someone had set them there deliberately. The light in the hallway flickered whenever I stepped underneath it, though it remained perfectly steady whenever I watched it directly. My keyboard was damp, as though someone had hovered over it, breathing heavily, leaving behind a faint sheen of moisture that made my skin crawl. I tried to rationalize it, but the more I attempted to explain these strange details away, the more apparent it became that I was forcing myself to believe a lie, grasping at any excuse to dismiss the growing dread pooling in my chest. And then, just when I thought I had reached the peak of my paranoia, my phone rang. The shrill tone shattered the heavy silence, making me jump so violently that I nearly knocked my coffee mug onto the floor. My breath hitched in my throat as I glanced at the screen, my heart pounding against my ribs. The number was unfamiliar, unlisted, completely random. Every instinct in my body told me to ignore it. But before I could stop myself, I was already answering. Hello. The line remained empty for several seconds, and the silence that followed was so profound that I could hear my own breath echoing back at me. Just as I was about to hang up, a voice finally spoke. John. A cold wave of relief washed over me. It was Amy. Jesus, Amy, where the hell have you been? I've been trying to reach you for days. I let out a nervous laugh, realizing only then just how tense my body had become. There was a slight pause before she responded, her voice oddly flat and emotionless, as if she were speaking from somewhere distant and hollow. Oh, yeah. Sorry. I've just been busy. A deep and involuntary shiver crept down my spine. Something about the way she spoke felt deeply unnatural, like her words had been rehearsed, like they didn't quite belong to her. It wasn't just the lack of warmth or familiarity, it was something else. Something I couldn't explain. You sound weird, I said, forcing out a chuckle to mask the uneasy feeling twisting in my gut. Are you okay? There was another pause, longer this time. When she finally spoke again, her voice was eerily neutral. Why haven't you left your apartment? I felt the blood drain from my face. My grip on the phone tightened as my breath quickened. What? You haven't left, she repeated, her tone unwavering, unchanging. Why? I swallowed hard, my throat dry and constricted. My eyes flicked toward my locked front door, a wave of nausea rolling through me. Amy, what the hell are you talking about? What's going on? She didn't respond right away. And then, softly, quietly, she said something that made my skin prickle with fear. Because they know you're still inside. A sharp and immediate panic surged through me, making my entire body go rigid. And then, the call cut out. For a long moment, I stood there, staring down at my phone, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts. My fingers trembled as I swiped to my call history, but the number she had called from was already gone, erased, as if it had never existed at all. The apartment suddenly felt much smaller, the walls pressing inward, the air thick and stifling. And then, a sound. Not inside my apartment, but outside my door. A slow, deliberate shuffling against the old carpeted hallway, a movement so soft that I might not have noticed it if I hadn't been standing completely still. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. A second later, a knock echoed through the silence. Not loud, not urgent, just 3, slow, deliberate taps against the wood. A sickening dread flooded my body. I forced myself to take a step forward, my movement stiff and unnatural, like my limbs no longer wanted to obey me. Pressing my ear against the door, I strained to hear anything, any hint of who, or what, might be standing outside. Nothing. Just silence. I held my breath. And then, just as I was about to step away, the knock came again. 3, slow, deliberate taps. My pulse thundered in my ears, my body screaming at me to run, to lock myself away, to pretend I had never heard anything at all. But I needed to see. I needed to know. Swallowing my fear, I forced myself forward and pressed my eye against the peephole. The hallway was empty. A long, cold breath shuddered out of my lungs, my hands still trembling as I gripped the doorframe for support. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe. The light in the hallway flickered. For the briefest fraction of a second, I saw it. A shadow, impossibly tall and completely motionless, standing just inches from my door. The light flickered again, and it was gone. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The silence returned, heavier than before, wrapping around me like a thick fog. I wasn't alone in this building. And now I knew, without a doubt, that whatever was out there, knew that I knew. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have. The last thing I recall is sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at my locked front door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. I was wide awake, my mind racing through the events of the past few days, desperately trying to piece together a rational explanation. But then, at some point, exhaustion must have taken over, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of my own breath, ragged and uneven, my clothes damp with sweat. The apartment was eerily still, the weight of silence pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. My phone lay beside me, the screen cracked, a detail I didn't remember from the night before. When I picked it up, the battery was drained to 1%, even though I had charged it before going to bed. And then I noticed the worst part. My front door was unlocked. I shot up so fast my vision blurred, my pulse hammering in my ears as I stumbled toward the door. I had locked it. I knew I had locked it. My hands were shaking as I reached out, hesitating just inches from the knob, half expecting it to turn on its own. But nothing happened. A deep and relentless paranoia settled into my bones. Had someone been inside while I slept? Had they stood over me, watching? The thought sent a violent shudder through me, but I forced myself to push past it. I needed air. I needed to get out of this apartment. For the first time in days, I decided to step outside. The moment I left my building, I knew something was very, very wrong. It was mid-morning, or at least, it should have been. The sky was the color of dull cement, a suffocating layer of thick, unmoving clouds stretching in every direction, swallowing the sun completely. The air felt stagnant, too still, as if the wind had been cut from the world. And the city? Empty. The sidewalks, usually bustling with people walking to work or grabbing coffee, were completely deserted. Cars sat motionless at green lights, parked haphazardly along the streets with their doors locked, their windows dark. Shops that should have been open had their closed signs hanging crookedly in the windows, some of them swaying ever so slightly, though there was no breeze to move them. I pulled out my phone, ignoring the way my fingers trembled against the screen, and tried to call Amy again. The call wouldn't go through. No dial tone, no busy signal, just dead silence. When I tried checking my messages, I realized my inbox was completely empty. Not just unread, gone. Every conversation, every text, every call log, wiped clean as if they had never existed at all. A deep nausea swelled in my gut. I started walking, my footsteps too loud against the pavement, echoing through the hollow streets in a way that made my skin crawl. It felt like I was being watched, like unseen eyes were following my every move. At the intersection ahead, the traffic lights were blinking at random intervals, switching between red, green, and yellow with no pattern. The sight sent a fresh wave of unease through me, but I kept moving. I needed to find someone, anyone. That was when I saw the man. At least, I think it was a man. He stood at the far end of the street, half shrouded in the shadows of a crumbling alleyway, his face obscured by the dim morning light. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, still as a statue, watching me. A cold prickle of fear spread through my limbs. I hesitated, debating whether to call out, but before I could, the man stepped backward, vanishing into the darkness without making a single sound. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. Something about the way he moved wasn't right, not hurried, not startled. Just, deliberate. Like he had been waiting for me to see him. My pulse pounded as I forced myself to keep going, moving faster now, my paranoia escalating with each step. I had to get out of here. I turned a corner, heading toward the nearest convenience store, but when I reached the entrance, I stopped dead. The automatic doors were slightly open, just enough to let the dim light inside spill onto the pavement. Inside, the aisles were wrecked, shelves overturned, snack bags torn open, items scattered across the floor as if something had ransacked the place in a hurry. But that wasn't the worst part. Behind the counter, the security monitor was still running, the screens flickering with grainy black and white footage of the store's interior. And on one of the monitors, clear as day, was me. Standing just outside the door. My breath caught in my chest. I looked up, eyes darting toward the small security camera mounted above the entrance. I could see its tiny red light blinking. It was recording. But the footage wasn't live. Because in the video, I wasn't alone. Something stood directly behind me. I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs, expecting to see someone, something, looming over me. But the sidewalk was empty. The street was still. There was nothing there. I turned back to the monitor, my pulse hammering so loudly it drowned out my own thoughts. The figure in the video hadn't moved. It stood inches from me, featureless, its body blurred like a corrupted image, its head slightly tilted as if studying me. And then, without warning, it turned its head toward the camera. The screen cut to static. A sharp ringing noise erupted in my ears, piercing and high-pitched, so loud I nearly dropped my phone. I stumbled backward, my vision swimming, a sudden wave of vertigo crashing over me. I pressed my hands against my temples, trying to steady myself, but the noise only grew louder, splitting through my skull like a drill. I needed to get out. I needed to get back to my apartment. I turned and sprinted, my lungs burning as I weaved through the empty streets, my surroundings warping in my peripheral vision, shadows stretching and twisting at the edges of my sight. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to move faster, to not look back, to run. By the time I reached my building, my entire body was shaking. My legs nearly gave out as I stumbled through the front door, slamming it shut behind me, gasping for air. And then, my blood turned to ice. My apartment door was open. Just a crack. Just enough for the darkness inside to spill out into the dimly lit hallway. But I knew. I had locked it before I left. Every muscle in my body went rigid as a deep, suffocating sense of dread sank its claws into me. The silence of the building pressed against my ears, thick and oppressive, so heavy I could barely breathe. And then, from the darkness beyond the door, a floorboard creaked. Something was inside. Waiting for me. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in the dimly lit hallway, staring at my slightly open apartment door. My heart was pounding so violently that I could feel the pulse in my throat, my breaths coming in short, panicked gasps as I struggled to convince myself that this wasn't happening. The door had been locked before I left. I was absolutely certain of that. And yet, here it was, ajar by just an inch or two, a thin sliver of darkness spilling out from within, stretching across the hallway floor like an open wound. It was as if the apartment itself had been waiting for me to return, patiently keeping its secrets in the suffocating silence. But the worst part? That sound. Somewhere inside, deep within the darkness of my home, I had heard it, a single, deliberate creak of the floorboards, as though someone, or something, had shifted ever so slightly, waiting for me to step inside. I had two choices. I could turn around, walk away, leave everything behind, pretend none of this had ever happened. Or I could go inside and face whatever had taken up residence in my apartment, whatever had crept through my locked door, whatever had been waiting for me in the silence. I didn't even realize I had already made my decision until my shaking fingers brushed against the cold metal of the doorknob. I took a breath, forced myself forward, and stepped inside. The apartment felt different. It wasn't just that it was dark, or that the air was stale, or that an unnatural stillness had settled into the very walls. It was something deeper, something I couldn't quite explain, a sensation that I wasn't walking into my home, but into a perfect imitation of it, a space that looked the same but somehow wasn't. I moved carefully, my breath shallow, my muscles coiled with tension, listening for any indication that I was not alone. But there was nothing, no shuffling footsteps, no hushed breathing, no shifting shadows in my periphery. Just silence, thick and heavy, pressing down on me like a lead weight. I checked every room, turned on every light, forced myself to look into every darkened corner, expecting, dreading, that I would find something lurking there. But everything was exactly as I had left it. Except for my computer. The screen was on. That was impossible. I had turned it off before I left. I was certain of it. And yet, here it was, humming softly in the darkness, the glow of the monitor casting eerie, elongated shadows across my desk. My fingers trembled as I reached for the mouse, hesitating for just a moment before nudging it ever so slightly. The screen flickered. An email was open. I hadn't written it. From, unknown. Subject, seen with your own eyes. Don't trust them. They. The message ended abruptly, cut off mid-sentence as if something had interrupted the sender before they could finish. My stomach twisted as I stared at it, a creeping nausea curling through my gut. Who had sent this? How had it appeared on my screen while I was gone? And, more importantly, what had they meant by them? I tried to check the sender's address, but the moment I clicked, the email vanished. No trace of it remained in my inbox, not even in my trash folder. It was as if it had never existed at all. My pulse hammered in my ears as I pulled up my chat logs, desperate to see if Amy had messaged me again, if she had any explanation for what was happening. But when I opened our conversation, my blood ran cold. The messages had changed. The same conversations I had been having with her for years, the same inside jokes, the same late-night rants about life and work and relationships, they weren't the same anymore. Words had been altered, entire exchanges rewritten, twisted into something unfamiliar. In one of the messages, she had originally asked me how my day was going. But now, it said, "Why are you still inside?" Another one had been a conversation about an old movie we had both liked. Now it simply read, "It's already too late, John." I felt my stomach lurch as I scrolled faster, my eyes darting over each message, searching for something, anything, that still made sense. But none of it did. It was as though someone had gone through our entire chat history and carefully, methodically, rewritten my past. My breath caught in my throat when I reached the last message. I hadn't sent it. From me to Amy. Message: "You already know the truth." A strangled noise escaped my lips as I shoved myself away from the desk, my chair skidding across the floor with a sharp, grating screech. I hadn't typed that. My fingers had never touched the keyboard. But there it was, staring back at me from the screen, proof that someone, or something, had been in my system, had been using my name, had been speaking in my voice. The nausea surged in my gut, my body screaming at me to leave, to get out, to run as far away from this place as possible. And then, the webcam light blinked on. I went completely still. A slow, suffocating horror gripped me as I turned my head, my gaze shifting toward the small camera perched on top of my monitor. The screen flickered. The webcam feed opened itself. And for the first time, I saw it. A grainy, distorted image filled the screen, the pixels warping and shifting as if struggling to maintain their form. At first, I thought the camera was simply reflecting my empty room, until I saw the figure standing behind me. It was tall, impossibly tall, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally, its shadowy form lacking any distinct features. But what terrified me the most wasn't its presence. It was the fact that it wasn't moving. It wasn't swaying. It wasn't breathing. It wasn't even blinking. It was just watching. The air in the room turned ice cold. A slow, sickening dread slithered through my veins, locking every muscle in my body into place. I wanted to turn around, to see if it was really there or if it was just an illusion on the screen. But I couldn't. Because deep down, in the darkest part of my mind, I already knew. If I turned around, it would be closer. The screen flickered again. The figure tilted its head. And then the webcam feed cut to black. I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending that I have any control over this. Every rational thought I've tried to hold on to has been slipping through my fingers like sand, dissolving into the growing paranoia that has begun to consume me whole. I keep telling myself that I'm just tired, that the isolation is playing tricks on my mind, that I just need to sleep, eat something, take a break from my computer, get some fresh air, but none of that matters anymore. Because I'm not just seeing things. I'm losing time. It started this morning, or at least, I think it was morning. Time has started feeling distorted, stretched and compressed in ways I can't understand. I had been sitting on my bed, my back pressed against the headboard, staring at the dark screen of my computer, still too afraid to turn it back on after what I had seen the night before. The memory of that moment, of the thing standing behind me, was still burned into my brain, replaying in my mind like a corrupted video file, glitching, flickering, wrong. And then, in the blink of an eye, I was somewhere else. I wasn't in my bed anymore. I was sitting at my desk, hands hovering over my keyboard, a deep ache settling into my shoulders like I had been there for hours. The computer screen was on, displaying an open document filled with endless lines of text, words that I didn't remember writing. You let US in. 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 The phrase repeated over and over, a chaotic mess of letters and spaces, flooding the screen, stretching endlessly down the page. My breath caught in my throat as I scrolled, my fingers trembling violently against the mouse. It just kept going. Hundreds of lines. Thousands. I hadn't written this. I knew I hadn't written this. But the document was open under my name, my account, my files, as if my own hands had typed every word while my mind had been somewhere else, lost in the void. And then the lights flickered. My heart slammed against my ribs as I snapped my head toward the ceiling. The single bulb overhead buzzed loudly, casting erratic flashes of light that sent the shadows in my apartment stretching and twisting across the walls. The air grew heavy, thick, suffocating, the silence curling around me like unseen hands. And then, I heard it. A whisper. Right behind me. I spun around so fast that my chair nearly toppled over, my breath caught in my throat, my body bracing for whatever horror was lurking in the darkness. But there was nothing. No one. Just the stillness of my apartment, pressing in on me from all sides. I let out a shaky breath, pressing a trembling hand to my chest, trying to force my heartbeat to slow. But then the whisper came again. And this time, it came from the bathroom. I turned my head slowly, my pulse roaring in my ears. The door was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it so impossibly deep that it looked more like a hole in the world than the entrance to a room. The whispering was soft, rhythmic, like a breath against my ear, just on the edge of my comprehension. I stepped forward. I don't know why I did it. Every single instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to leave the apartment, to get as far away from that doorway as possible. But it was as if something had taken hold of me, guiding me forward, pulling me in. With a shaking hand, I reached for the light switch. The moment my fingers brushed against it, the whispering stopped. A cold, suffocating silence filled the air. And then I saw it. Something had been scratched into the bathroom mirror. For words, jagged and uneven, carved into the glass as if by fingernails, the letters cutting through the reflection in a way that made my stomach churn. You let us in. My vision blurred as a wave of dizziness washed over me, my knees nearly buckling beneath me. A sharp pain bloomed in my skull, a deep, pulsating ache that made my thoughts sluggish, disjointed. It felt like something was pressing against my mind, stretching the edges of my consciousness, forcing its way in. I stumbled backward, gripping the doorframe for support, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I needed to get out of here. I needed to get out. But then a knock at my front door. Loud. Insistent. Wrong. My entire body locked up, a wave of cold terror flooding through my veins. My apartment had been silent for days, the entire building eerily empty, the world outside abandoned and lifeless. No one was supposed to be here. And yet, someone was knocking. I took a shaky step toward the door, my hands clammy, my vision tunneling as my ears strained to hear anything beyond the thick wooden barrier. Silence. No footsteps. No rustling of clothes. No shadow shifting beneath the doorframe. Just the heavy, suffocating stillness, pressing in from all sides. I swallowed hard, forcing down the rising panic in my throat. I needed to check. I needed to see. With painstaking slowness, I stepped forward, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs as I pressed my eye against the peephole. Darkness. There was nothing there. No person. No figure. No movement in the hallway. Just an empty void, stretching endlessly beyond the distorted fisheye lens. And yet. Another knock. My breath hitched violently in my throat. I hadn't looked away. I had been staring directly at the peephole when the knock came again. And there had been nothing there. The walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in, the pressure in my skull growing unbearable, a deep and suffocating dread sinking its claws into me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to wake up. But then, from the other side of the door. A voice. Low. Distorted. Familiar. John. Open the door. I don't know how much time passed as I stood there, frozen, staring at the door, my breath trapped in my chest like a caged animal. The voice that had spoken my name was still ringing in my ears, sinking into my skin like something infectious, something I would never be able to scrub away. It had sounded like Amy. But it wasn't Amy. There was something fundamentally wrong with the way she had said my name, something off in the tone, in the pacing, in the empty spaces between the syllables. It was as if the voice had been constructed rather than spoken, carefully assembled piece by something that had never actually heard a real person talk before. And the worst part? I hadn't heard her arrive. No footsteps in the hallway, no sound of the elevator or the stairwell door opening. It was as if she had simply appeared on the other side of my door, materializing from the void itself. The knock came again, sharper this time, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there had grown impatient. "John," the voice repeated, softer now. "Come on. Open up." I clenched my teeth, my hands balled into fists at my sides, my entire body trembling. My mouth was dry, my thoughts spiraling, my heart hammering so violently in my chest that I thought it might burst. I wanted to answer. I wanted to say something, anything, just to make it stop. But every instinct in my body screamed at me not to, a deep and primal fear coiling around my ribs like a vice. Instead, I took a slow, shuddering step backward, inching away from the door, forcing myself to move as silently as possible. And that was when the peephole went dark. A shadow had passed over it. Someone, or something, was standing directly on the other side, so close that its presence blocked out the light entirely. A cold wave of nausea rolled through me. I could feel my entire body tightening, my skin prickling with an unbearable, clawing wrongness. The air in my apartment felt thick, like something unseen was pressing against my walls, testing them, waiting for me to break. Then, suddenly, a different voice. "John. This is Officer Reynolds with the police department. We need you to open the door." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind struggled to process what I had just heard, tried to make sense of it, but I couldn't. The shift had been too sudden. One moment, it had been Amy, or the thing that had been pretending to be her, and then, without pause, without even the sound of movement, the voice had changed. And now it was the police. My skin crawled. I forced myself forward, pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear anything beyond it, any whisper of movement, any sign that someone was really there. But there was nothing. Just silence. Too much silence. I swallowed hard, my fingers twitching at my sides. Why are you here?" My voice came out uneven, barely more than a whisper. There was a pause. Then. "We received a call from your friend, Amy. She said she's been trying to reach you, and that you weren't responding." I clenched my jaw, my stomach twisting violently. That was a lie. Amy hadn't just called me. She had spoken to me through the door. The voice on the other side of the wood continued, calm, patient, as if trying to reassure me. "She was concerned about your well-being. She said you've been acting strange, that you might be experiencing paranoia, possibly a mental health crisis. We just want to make sure you're okay." I stepped away from the door, my head spinning. None of this made sense. None of this was real. And yet, they knew exactly what to say to make me doubt myself. I ran a shaking hand through my hair, my breath uneven, my pulse roaring in my ears. My thoughts were unraveling, coming apart at the seams. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to open the door, let them in, let this be over. But I knew. I knew the moment I turned that handle, the moment I let them inside, something terrible would happen. I wasn't sure how I knew, but I did. And then. Another voice. Amy again. "John, please," she said, her voice softer now, pleading. "They're here to help. Just open the door." My entire body locked up, my vision tunneling. She was there again. I had heard her before. But I had never heard her arrive. The walls of my apartment suddenly felt too close, too tight, pressing inward, the air thick with something invisible and hungry. A deep, writhing sense of dread slithered through me, coiling around my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I needed to get away from the door. Now. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my desk chair, my legs trembling beneath me. My eyes darted wildly around the apartment, looking for, what? A way out? A weapon? Nothing seemed real anymore. Everything felt like a set piece, like a fabricated stage created just to keep me here, keep me trapped, keep me waiting. Another knock. Louder. Heavier. "We can force entry if necessary, John," the officer's voice said, firm but patient. "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying to suppress the panicked gasps escaping my lips. They weren't real. They weren't real. I repeated it over and over in my head, gripping onto the thought like a lifeline, trying to anchor myself in something, anything. Then. A scratching noise. From the other side of the door. Long, slow, deliberate. Like nails dragging down the wood. A voice, not Amy, not the officer, something else, spoke in a whisper so quiet, so close, that I could feel it in my bones. "You already let us in." I snapped. With a strangled cry, I lunged forward and grabbed my desk lamp, ripping it from the wall and hurling it at the door with all the strength I had left. The sound was deafening, the glass shattering on impact, the light flickering wildly before dying altogether. And then. Silence. The knocking stopped. The voices stopped. The scratching stopped. Everything just stopped. For the longest time, I didn't move. I just stood there, my chest heaving, my entire body trembling, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But it didn't. The only sound was my own ragged breathing, my own pounding heartbeat. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself forward, one slow, agonizing step at a time, until I reached the door. With a shaking hand, I reached out, pressed my fingers against the cold wood, and finally, hesitantly, leaned forward to look through the peephole. There was nothing. No police. No Amy. No shadows shifting in the dim hallway. Just emptiness. Like no one had ever been there at all. I don't know how long I've been sitting here, my back pressed tightly against the door, my fingers digging into the cold, unyielding wood as though sheer will alone could keep whatever is out there from coming inside. My breathing is uneven, shallow gasps that do nothing to steady my pounding heart, my vision swaying with exhaustion and fear. The weight of the silence around me is suffocating, heavier than anything I have ever felt before. The walls seem closer than they were before, the air thicker, the shadows deeper. But I know, that I cannot move. The knocking has stopped, but I am not foolish enough to believe that means it's over. If anything, the silence is worse. The absence of sound is not peace, it is a trap, a gaping mouth waiting for me to step forward, waiting for me to let my guard down. I am not that naive, not anymore. I have seen too much, felt too much. The world has been peeling away at the edges, unraveling like an old, worn-out tapestry, and I am no longer sure where the real ends and the unreal begins. But this I know is real. Something is outside my door. Something that knows my name. I press my palms against the wood, feeling the grain beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in the solid certainty of the door's existence. As long as this door remains closed, as long as I keep my body wedged against it, I am safe. I have to be. Then, the whispering begins again. At first, it is faint, just a thread of sound, something I could almost convince myself is nothing more than the wind seeping through cracks in the building. But it grows. The syllables slither under the door like smoke, curling around me in soft, insidious murmurs that tickle at my ears, worming their way into my skull like intrusive thoughts I can't shake. At first, it is unintelligible, a chorus of voices speaking at once, an eerie cacophony of whispers layered over each other, voices too high, too low, too disjointed to make sense. But then, slowly, they begin to coalesce, to take shape, to mimic. It is my own voice. They are whispering my own words back to me. Every doubt I have ever voiced aloud, every desperate plea, every fractured thought spoken into the emptiness of my apartment, it is all coming back now, a sick, twisted echo of myself, warped and wrong. I hear the hesitation in my own tone, the fear I have tried to suppress, but they are feeding it back to me, amplifying it, making it unbearable. And then, the voices start laughing. Not real laughter, not human laughter, but something mechanical, broken, something that grates against my ears like rusted gears grinding together. The sound fills the room, bouncing off the walls in a way that shouldn't be possible, making the air vibrate as though the very fabric of reality is starting to come apart at the seams. The floor beneath me shudders. The walls tremble, a faint vibration that runs through my spine, making my teeth ache. The pressure in the air changes, a sudden drop that makes my ears pop, and for one heart-stopping moment, it feels as though the entire apartment is breathing. And then, the lights go out. I don't mean they flicker, I don't mean they dim, I mean they are gone. An all-consuming blackness swallows the room, an unnatural void that stretches far beyond the absence of light. It is not darkness in the way of a power outage, where your eyes can adjust, where there is still a trace of ambient glow from the city beyond your window. This darkness is alive. It moves. It reaches for me. I feel it curling against my skin, cold and slick, pressing against my arms, my legs, my throat. I try to breathe, but it feels like I am inhaling something thick, something viscous, something that is pressing into my lungs and filling me up with its presence. And then, Amy's voice. "John, please. Please open the door." Her voice is fragile, on the edge of breaking, exactly the way I remember it when she was scared, when she needed me. I can picture her face in my mind, eyes wide, lips trembling, a barely contained panic beneath the surface of her expression. "I don't know what's happening," she says, voice shaking. "I think they're after me, too. Please, John, please let me in." My hands grip the floor on either side of me, fingers digging into the wooden panels hard enough that my knuckles ache. I can't move. I won't move. "John, I'm scared," she sobs. "They're here. They're coming." "I don't." Her voice cuts off. Silence. A long, horrible silence that stretches on for so long that I almost believe she is gone. Then, a single, slow breath. It is no longer Amy. I feel my stomach drop, an icy weight sinking into the pit of my gut. I don't know how I know, but I do. The thing on the other side of the door is no longer trying to sound like her. It no longer cares. The breath is wrong. Too slow. Too deliberate. Then, the doorknob turns. I feel the motion against my back, a slow, agonizing rotation of metal, a casual, lazy attempt to open the door as if I am no longer even worth pretending for. The realization sends a deep, visceral terror through me, something that coils around my spine and squeezes. My breath catches in my throat. I don't know what will happen if that door opens. I don't know what I will see. I don't want to know. The door rattles slightly, just enough to make the frame creak. I squeeze my eyes shut. I won't move. But then, I see it. Not with my eyes, but somewhere deeper, somewhere just beyond my vision. The darkness shifts. Something is smiling at me. Not outside the door. Not in the hallway. Inside the room. With me. I do not know how much longer I can keep fighting this, nor do I fully understand whether there is even anything left to fight for. My body feels heavy, weighed down by exhaustion so deep it seeps into my bones, but more than that, it is my mind that feels like it is unraveling. I have spent what feels like an eternity pressing my back against this door, using every last ounce of willpower to keep whatever lurks beyond it from stepping inside. And yet, despite all my efforts, despite every desperate attempt to resist, I cannot escape the creeping, suffocating certainty that it is no longer on the other side of the door. It is already inside with me. My hands shake violently as I grip the wooden floor beneath me, my fingertips digging into the cracks between the panels as if that alone will keep me grounded in reality. But what even is reality anymore? The room around me feels different, almost imperceptibly so, yet unmistakably wrong. The walls seem too smooth, the shadows in the corners stretch in unnatural ways, and the air is thick with a sensation I cannot quite name, something beyond the simple feeling of being watched. Then, without warning, the whispering begins again. I squeeze my eyes shut, my breathing shallow, my heart hammering violently against my ribs as I brace myself against the flood of voices that slither into my ears like an infestation of writhing insects. At first, it is nothing but an incoherent murmur, a collection of distorted syllables overlapping in an eerie, rhythmic pattern, but then the words begin to take shape, familiar words, words I have spoken myself. Every doubt I have ever uttered, every late-night confession to the empty space around me, every whispered fear I have voiced in moments of weakness, it repeats them all back to me. But the voices do not merely imitate me. They become me. I hear my own voice calling out from the darkness, taunting me, mocking me, pleading with me, breaking apart and reforming into something fractured and unnatural. The echoes multiply, twisting into an unbearable cacophony that drowns out every rational thought, leaving me grasping at the edges of my own sanity as the world around me begins to unravel. And then, the door disappears. I feel it vanish behind me, not with a slam or a creak, but in a way that should be impossible. One moment, I can feel the solid wood pressing against my spine, a reassuring barrier between me and whatever horrors exist outside, and the next, it is simply gone. There is no wall. No door. No threshold to guard. Only an infinite, yawning abyss that stretches out before me, swallowing everything in its wake. I am no longer in my apartment. I do not know where I am. Or if I was ever there at all. The darkness swells around me, shifting, pulsing, taking shape in ways that defy logic and perception. Shadows twist into corridors that should not exist, doorways open into places I have never seen, and figures emerge from the void, figures that resemble people I should know but whose faces are just slightly off. Amy is standing there. Or at least, something wearing her face. She smiles at me, but the expression does not reach her eyes, which are too wide, too bright, too knowing. Her lips move, forming words that do not match the voice that comes out, a layered distortion of sound that does not belong in this world. John, she says, her voice splitting apart into a dozen whispers overlapping at once. Come with me. It's okay now. You don't have to fight anymore. I step back, but there is nowhere to retreat to. The ground beneath me no longer feels solid. The air is thick, pressing in, forcing me to make a decision. Stay here and pretend that nothing has changed. Or step forward and finally see the truth. Something deep within me screams that this is the final moment, the last chance to choose. If I refuse, I will remain trapped in this fragmented, dissolving version of my own mind, locked in a loop of false security, a prisoner in a world that is no longer real. Thank you for watching this story to the end. Subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with new stories. I also look forward to your comments, criticisms and suggestions below this video.